Picture this. You wake up to the screaming whine of chainsaws butchering century-old oak trees that have shaded your backyard since your great-grandfather cleared this land with an axe and a dream. The acrid smoke of burning wood mixes with the chemical stench of industrial herbicide as you watch $90,000 of your mandatory HOA fees disappear into what used to be a natural wildlife sanctuary. It's for property values, HOA President Karen Mitchell announces smugly from her spotless white Range Rover. What this former insurance adjuster didn't know? I'm a retired wildlife biologist, and she just declared war on an ecosystem that took 200 years to build. Fast forward 8 months. Karen's $1.3 million McMansion sits surrounded by dead soil where nothing grows, foundation shifting as the root systems that held everything together rot underground, while my modest home sits in a natural paradise that increases in value every year. The state environmental agency is building a criminal case against her, and that sterile lawn she was so proud of? It's about to cost her everything. What would you do if your HOA stole your money to destroy your family's legacy? Where are you watching from? I bet your neighbors have tried something equally insane. My name's Tom Hartley, 62 years old, and until 8 months ago, I thought the biggest threat to my sanity was finding parts for my grandfather's 1948 Ford pickup that still runs like the day it rolled off the assembly line. Turns out I was wrong. The real threat was an HOA president who confused a background in insurance fraud investigation with a degree in environmental science. I inherited my great-grandfather's 4-acre piece of heaven in what used to be rural Georgia, back when Magnolia Springs was nothing but peach orchards, and the only HOA stood for harmony of agriculture. My great-grandfather Samuel Hartley was a timber surveyor who walked these woods during the Depression and decided this was where his family would put down roots. This oak grove was his cathedral. Every morning for the 4 years since retiring from the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, I'd follow the same routine. Coffee on the wraparound porch, listening to songbirds welcome the dawn from branches older than the Civil War, the scent of sawdust from my woodworking shop mixing with honeysuckle and morning dew, the sound of my grandfather's wind chimes echoing through ancient oak canopy at sunrise, my boots following dirt paths Samuel laid by hand in 1934. Rebecca, my wife of 28 years, runs the county library and has the diplomatic skills of a United Nations ambassador, which she'd need for what was coming. Our children grew up and scattered like dandelion seeds. Sarah's saving coral reefs as a marine biologist in Florida. David's designing sustainable buildings in Seattle. Both inherited Samuel's love for living things. What made our property unique wasn't the 1940s farmhouse or my cluttered workshop full of reclaimed wood projects. It was 200 heritage oak trees with land conservation easements dating to 1889, older than the State Forestry Service, older than environmental law, and definitely older than suburban developers with attitude problems. Then came Magnolia Springs Estates, sprouting around us like expensive concrete mushrooms after a profitable rain. 52 homes, average price $1.1 million. Mostly Atlanta refugees fleeing their own overcrowded subdivisions. The irony was thicker than Georgia humidity in August. Enter our villain, Karen Mitchell, 48, HOA board president and self-appointed guardian of suburban conformity. Fresh from Gwinnett County with that particular blend of entitlement and environmental ignorance that only comes from investigating insurance claims for people who think nature exists to serve their convenience. White Range Rover, vanity plates reading adjuster, and those oversized sunglasses she wore like armor against reality. Her husband runs some financial consulting firm that specializes in tax shelters. Kids attend private academy where they probably learned that people like me are environmentally backward rather than environmentally educated. Their $1.3 million contemporary glass house backs directly up to my oak grove, with manicured artificial turf ending where real ecosystems begin. The first attack came on a Wednesday morning that smelled like fresh coffee and impending environmental crimes. Official HOA violation notice, certified mail. Excessive vegetation creating fire hazards and pest habitats violates community safety standards. Fine, $300 per day until compliance achieved. I read it 3 times, the ecological absurdity sinking in like rainwater into forest soil. Here's what Karen's expensive consultants missed. My property predates their HOA by 90 years. Samuel's deed included mineral rights, timber rights, and a conservation easement that protects the oak grove in perpetuity. But they were betting this old tree hugger wouldn't know environmental law. The face-to-face confrontation went exactly as you'd expect. Karen's office reeked of synthetic air freshener and barely contained panic. She suggested with that practice smile insurance adjuster's perfect while denying legitimate claims that I might be happier somewhere with more flexible landscaping standards. Translation: somewhere poor people belong. I responded with a certified letter explaining that conservation easements supersede HOA covenants. Basic environmental law. First thing they teach when you're dealing with protected habitats and endangered species. Her retaliation was swift and expensive. Anonymous complaints to the county about illegal timber operations because apparently maintaining heritage trees looks suspicious to people who pay others to rake their plastic lawns. Building inspectors spent 3 hours examining my woodworking shop, found nothing wrong except my organizational philosophy. Still cost me around $500 in legal fees proving I wasn't running an illegal sawmill. But that was just Karen testing the ecosystem, literally and figuratively. The real environmental terrorism started when she discovered my conservation easement complicated her plans for total aesthetic control. In Karen's world, people like me with dirt under their fingernails and protected habitats don't deserve either. That's when I realized this wasn't about fire safety. This was ecological warfare. Spring migration was running heavy that year, and the oak grove was alive with returning songbirds building nests in branches that had sheltered their ancestors for generations. The sound of morning chorus mixed with the rustle of leaves that had been photosynthesizing since before electricity existed. It should have been peaceful. Instead, it became the soundtrack to Karen's next brilliant legal maneuver. She'd done her research this time, or thought she had. Hired Blackstone Environmental Consulting, an Atlanta firm that specialized in what they politely called habitat modification permitting, which is corporate speak for creative ways to destroy nature using government regulations. Their strategy was elegant in its environmental ruthlessness. File a public safety complaint with the county claiming my property created dangerous conditions that threatened those precious million-dollar homes with excessive wildlife activity and uncontrolled vegetation growth. The legal papers arrived on a Friday morning, thick as a college textbook and about as useful. 73 pages of pseudoscientific jargon that basically said, make the old hippie prove his 200-year-old forest isn't going to kill our clients with falling branches and raccoon invasions. They wanted to force me into a $75,000 environmental impact study. You know, the kind that takes 18 months and requires hiring the same consultants who probably play golf with their lawyers on weekends. Rebecca found me that evening sitting among the oak roots, my back against the largest tree a giant Samuel had marked with his initials in 1936. "What are you thinking?" she asked, using that librarian voice that meant she could smell trouble brewing like a summer thunderstorm. "I'm thinking Karen's environmental consultants just made a $75,000 mistake," I said, watching fireflies begin their ancient dance among branches that predated her bloodline by several geological epochs. "And I'm thinking they picked the wrong retired biologist to mess with. See, here's something I learned during 35 years with Georgia Natural Resources. Environmental consultants love complicated-sounding ecological assessments because they assume regular people won't understand forest management. What they forget is that some of us actually spent our careers studying the systems they're trying to regulate. It's like watching someone explain bird migration to the guy who's been banding them for 3 decades. I called my old colleague Maria Santos at the Georgia Environmental Protection Division. Took her exactly 5 minutes to spot what Blackstone Environmental had missed. They'd based their entire safety complaint on urban forestry guidelines designed for city parks. Before climate change intensified, before invasive species management became critical, before modern wildlife corridor research changed everything we knew about suburban ecosystems. "Tom," Maria laughed over the phone, "these guidelines are for managing trees next to shopping malls, not heritage forests with protected status. You want me to send the real habitat assessment protocols? This is going to be professionally embarrassing for them." The current environmental science told a completely different story. Far from creating safety hazards, my oak grove actually prevented property damage by providing windbreak protection during severe weather. Those heritage trees Samuel had preserved weren't just beautiful. The old timber surveyor had maintained a natural disaster prevention system before most people knew what sustainable land management meant. But here's where it got really interesting. Back in forestry school, they taught us about something called prior conservation doctrine. Basically, Georgia environmental law protects habitats that predate development, especially when they're formally protected by conservation easements. Since my family had documented forest management dating to 1889, our protection status trumped anything filed after that date, including Karen's entire subdivision, her HOA, and probably her great-grandchildren's future landscaping complaints. I spent that weekend in my workshop, surrounded by Samuel's forestry journals and modern ecological survey maps, connecting environmental dots that Karen's consultants had completely missed. The familiar scent of cedar shavings mixed with old leather bindings, the scratch of pencil on graph paper. It felt like channeling the old surveyor's wisdom. And maybe I was. Monday morning, I filed my own complaint with the county. Not just a defense, but a counterattack. I demanded that Karen's group pay for a proper ecological assessment since their legal harassment was based on fraudulent environmental data. Attached Maria's analysis showing how their proposed tree removal would actually increase storm damage risk for everyone in the area. The county environmental coordinator, a woman named Dr. Patricia Williams, who'd been managing forest protection since before Karen discovered Georgia existed, took one look at my documentation and started shaking her head in disbelief. "Mr. Hartley," she said, "these people just tried to lecture a wildlife biologist about forest management using guidelines from strip mall landscaping. This might be the most scientifically illiterate environmental complaint in county history." 3 weeks later, complete vindication. The county sided with me on every point, ordered the HOA to cease all vegetation-related harassment, and officially reaffirmed my conservation easement status. Suddenly, my trees weren't just protected. They were recognized as a critical wildlife habitat requiring federal oversight for any modifications. But victory came with interesting ecological side effects. The local environmental groups ran the story. HOA challenges century-old forest protection, loses spectacularly. Neighbors I'd never met started appearing at my workshop door with their own Karen horror stories. Violations for native plant gardens, fines for unauthorized bird feeders, threats about non-conforming compost bins. That evening, Rebecca found me by the largest oak at sunset, Samuel's field journal in my hands, but no intention of actually reading. "This is where he taught me about trees," I told her. "How they always find a way to survive, but never forget their roots or abandon their community." "And what does this particular community need to survive?" she asked. I smiled, listening to evening songbirds settling into branches that had weathered storms longer than Karen's family had been in America, right through the heart of her perfect little artificial kingdom. You'd think losing an environmental protection case would teach someone about ecosystem respect. You'd be wrong. Karen Mitchell had apparently graduated from the School of Escalating Environmental Destruction because her next move was so audacious, it actually impressed me in a horrifying watching someone try to chainsaw down a redwood with a butter knife while claiming it's for forest health kind of way. 4 weeks after the county told her to respect conservation law, Karen called an emergency HOA board meeting. Of course, she scheduled it during the 1 week Rebecca and I had planned a vacation to visit Sarah in Key Largo, our first real break since this ecological nightmare started. The meeting notice got sent to our old address from 3 moves ago, ensuring we couldn't object to whatever fresh environmental insanity she was planning. The agenda item looked innocuous enough. Emergency Wildlife Management Assessment. What actually happened was Karen presenting doctored photographs showing severe property damage from uncontrolled tree growth and dangerous wildlife overpopulation. Pictures that looked suspiciously like they'd been taken after she'd hired someone to dump garbage near the oak grove to attract raccoons and then photograph the mess. She claimed her forestry consultant, a guy who turned out to be her brother-in-law's landscaping contractor, had determined that immediate tree removal was needed to prevent catastrophic property damage and potential liability lawsuits. The vote passed 7-1 with only Margaret Chen objecting. Margaret called me in Key Largo that night, her voice trembling with outrage. "Tom, this woman is absolutely insane. She says the trees will destroy everything if we don't cut them down immediately. She has pictures, but something feels completely fabricated. Special assessment, $2,200 per homeowner for emergency habitat modification infrastructure. Total project cost, $156,000 for what any actual environmentalist could have told them was completely unnecessary ecological destruction. But Karen had found her golden chainsaw, and suddenly every natural feature looked like a liability that needed eliminating. I cut our vacation short and drove through the night, Rebecca sleeping restlessly in the passenger seat while I white-knuckled the steering wheel and calculated how much irreversible damage they could inflict in 96 hours. The answer, as it turned out, was devastating. The sound hit me first, chainsaws screaming where morning birdsongs used to live. Then the smell. Wood smoke mixing with diesel exhaust and the chemical burn of industrial herbicide. I rounded the corner to my driveway and saw what Karen had done to 2 centuries of natural heritage. My oak grove was gone. In its place, an artificial desert of wood chips and chemical-scorched earth that looked like a strip mine explosion. Ancient trees that had survived Civil War bullets and countless storms lay in massive piles, their 200-year-old heartwood reduced to mulch for someone's flower beds. They'd poisoned the soil with enough herbicide to prevent anything from growing for years, destroying mycorrhizal networks that had connected these trees since before Georgia was a state. Rebecca stood beside me, tears streaming down her face as she watched a centuries-old ecosystem reduced to an environmental crime scene. "They murdered it," she whispered. "They actually murdered a living forest." But here's the thing about being an environmental biologist who spent 4 decades dealing with habitat protection regulations. You learn to think like an ecosystem, and ecosystems always regenerate, but they never forget. I spent the next week documenting everything. Photographs from every angle, soil samples for chemical analysis, species inventory of what had been destroyed. More importantly, I researched Pinnacle Tree Services, the company that had done the ecological assassination. Turns out they had quite the environmental rap sheet. 5 EPA violations in 7 years, $125,000 in fines for unauthorized habitat destruction, and a pattern of clear-cutting before permits were approved. Because here's something every property owner should understand. Any significant modification to protected habitats requires approval from the county, the state environmental agency, and often federal wildlife services. It's like a legal ecosystem with multiple layers of protection, and you need permission from every level. Karen's crew had ignored all of them. The Endangered Species Act doesn't mess around when it comes to unauthorized habitat destruction and protected wildlife corridors. I'd seen cases where violators face $50,000 per day in fines, and that was just the federal level. Georgia's Environmental Protection Division could add another $25,000 daily. The math was simple. Every day that ecological destruction remained unrestored was another $75,000 in potential fines. I filed complaints with every agency that had jurisdiction: County Environmental Enforcement, State Habitat Protection, and the EPA's Region 4 office in Atlanta. Then I called the local Audubon Society chapter, whose president nearly had a heart attack when I described what they'd done to the nesting areas. "Mr. Hartley," she said, "this is exactly the kind of habitat destruction we've been fighting for 30 years. We'll provide whatever support you need: legal, financial, expert witnesses. These people just declared war on every migratory bird in North America." The environmental counterattack was swift and comprehensive. Within 2 weeks, I had 4 separate government agencies investigating, an environmental law clinic from Emory University offering free legal representation, and enough documentation to bury Blackstone Environmental in their own pseudoscientific reports. But Karen wasn't finished. Margaret Chen warned me she was already planning the next escalation, a complete landscape modification program that would clear-cut the remaining forest from the county road to the subdivision boundary. Her reasoning: if we're going to modernize this area, we might as well do it comprehensively. That night, I sat in my workshop surrounded by Samuel's forestry journals, studying his 1940s photographs of the natural oak ecosystem. The old timber surveyor had preserved something magnificent that had supported wildlife for 80 years without a single property damage incident. Karen had destroyed it in 4 days, but she'd also just handed me enough federal violations to put her in prison. If you've ever wondered what environmental panic smells like, it's synthetic air freshener mixed with fear sweat in an insurance office at 6:30 a.m. That's where I found myself 4 weeks later, sitting across from Karen Mitchell as she tried to convince me that ecological destruction was actually environmental improvement. "Tom," she said, sliding a manila envelope across her glass desk, "I think we got off on the wrong foot. This whole situation has been a misunderstanding." Inside the envelope, a cashier's check for $650,000 and a non-disclosure agreement thicker than Samuel's forestry manual. The offer was simple and illegal as hell. Take the money, agree never to discuss the tree situation publicly, and relocate outside the county within 90 days. Oh, and sign over my conservation easement to the HOA for proper environmental management. The threat was barely veiled. Legal battles are expensive, Tom. Even when you win, you lose. Think about Rebecca's position at the county library. I'd brought a small digital recorder, perfectly legal in Georgia with single-party consent. And Karen's next words were prosecutorial gold. "If you don't take this offer, I'll make sure every property owner in this county knows you're an anti-development extremist who's trying to destroy our economic growth. My insurance industry connections run deep, and your wife's library funding could become complicated." That same week, my workshop got vandalized. This time, they weren't subtle about it. Hand tools scattered across the floor, wood projects destroyed, and my restored 1948 Ford had its tires slashed and windshield smashed. But they'd made a mistake. The new trail cameras I'd installed caught everything, including a clear shot of a white Range Rover parked at my property line at 1:45 a.m. The psychological warfare escalated daily. Anonymous online reviews started appearing for Rebecca's library literacy programs. Political agenda in children's education. Don't trust radical environmentalists with your kid's future. Someone called the county commissioners with concerns about her fitness to manage public educational resources. The stress was eating at both of us. Rebecca losing sleep, me checking my blood pressure medication twice a day. But here's what Karen didn't understand about environmental scientists. We're systematic. Every threat, every act of vandalism, every anonymous complaint got documented with the precision of a federal research study, because that's exactly what it was becoming. The EPA had opened a formal criminal investigation. The Georgia Attorney General's office sent enforcement agents. Local environmental groups were treating this like the BP oil spill of suburban habitat destruction, and I was gathering scientific allies faster than Karen was making enemies. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a graduate student in environmental law at Emory University, had taken my case as her doctoral dissertation project. She discovered something fascinating while analyzing HOA financial records, a pattern of inflated environmental consulting contracts with companies that had mysterious connections to Karen's insurance investigation network. Mr. Hartley, she said, spreading documents across my workshop table, this tree removal project cost $156,000 for work that should have been $50,000 maximum. The excess went to consulting fees and emergency contractor premiums that all traced back to companies owned by Karen's professional associates. The graduate student had found environmental crime where I'd only suspected corruption. Board meetings held in secret. Contracts approved without environmental review. Special assessments used to fund personal vendettas disguised as habitat management. What started as ecological destruction was looking more like organized environmental racketeering. But the real revelation came from Samuel's forestry journals. While researching the original forest management plan, I'd found his 1965 consulting report for the county, a document that predicted exactly what was happening now. He'd warned against large-scale tree removal in this specific location, calculating that it would increase erosion risk by 250% during heavy rain seasons and eliminate critical wildlife corridors. The report included detailed species inventories, seasonal migration patterns, and soil stability measurements. Everything Karen's environmental consultant had ignored. More importantly, it proved that someone with actual environmental credentials had already studied this ecosystem 60 years ago and reached the opposite conclusion from Karen's landscaper. That's when I realized the beautiful irony of the situation. Karen thought she was solving a safety problem, but she'd actually created an environmental time bomb. Spring storm season was 8 weeks away, and the destroyed root systems were going to turn every heavy rain into a mudslide aimed directly at the HOA homes' foundations. The natural oak grove had distributed stormwater through complex root networks that absorbed excess rainfall like a biological sponge. The clear-cut wasteland eliminated that natural protection, creating erosion channels that would direct 100% of rainwater straight toward million-dollar basements. I spent that weekend with my calculator, Samuel's soil surveys, and current weather predictions. The math was both terrifying and beautiful. When the spring storms hit, and they would hit hard that year, Karen's clear-cutting solution would turn manageable rainfall into a foundation-destroying flood. My property, being naturally elevated and still protected by remaining trees, would stay stable. The HOA homes sitting downstream from the destroyed watershed were going to flood like a marina during a hurricane. Margaret Chen stopped by that Sunday evening, finding me sketching reforestation plans at my kitchen table. "Tom," she said, "this woman Karen, she's made a terrible mistake." "Yes," I agreed, looking at Weather Service predictions showing heavy storm activity and wet spring ahead, then at Samuel's forestry calculations proving exactly what would happen when meteorology met stupidity. "Margaret," I said, "she just built the world's most expensive environmental lawsuit. The ecosystem is going to reclaim itself with interest." Dr. Jennifer Walsh arrived at my workshop on a gray April morning with a file box full of documents and the kind of expression that meant someone was about to face serious federal charges. Not me, thankfully. "Mr. Hartley," she said, setting the box on my workbench with a satisfying thump, "I think you need to see this evidence." For 4 weeks, Jennifer had been conducting what she called forensic environmental accounting on the HOA's financial records, basically following the money trail like a bloodhound with an environmental science degree. What she'd found would have made the EPA's Criminal Enforcement Unit celebrate with organic champagne, the tree removal project that cost homeowners $156,000. The actual work was worth maybe $50,000. The remaining $106,000 had disappeared into a maze of consulting fees, emergency contractor premiums, and environmental assessment costs that all led back to companies with suspiciously familiar names: Mitchell Environmental Consulting, Magnolia Springs Habitat Solutions. Karen wasn't just destroying my forest. She was robbing her own neighbors blind while committing environmental crimes. But that was just the beginning. The main evidence came when Margaret Chen shuffled into my workshop 30 minutes later, clutching a small digital recorder like it contained the secrets of the universe, which in a way, it did. "Tom," she said, her voice thick with righteous environmental anger, "you remember I told you I voted against the tree project? I maybe forgot to mention I recorded the whole meeting." The recording was devastating. Karen's voice clear as mountain air, explaining to the board that the real goal wasn't safety improvement. It was eliminating incompatible land use patterns that prevent our community from reaching its full economic potential. She'd explicitly discussed using HOA funds to force me into expensive legal battles, knowing most people couldn't afford to fight environmental crimes. The best part, her admission that the tree removal wasn't about preventing property damage. It was about eliminating anything that made the neighborhood look rural or underdeveloped. She wanted to remove every trace of the area's agricultural heritage to maximize property values for her insurance industry connections. But the real bombshell was buried in Samuel's forestry files. While organizing his papers for the legal case, I'd found a folder marked Magnolia Springs Development Consultation, 1968. Inside, a complete ecological analysis he'd done for the county, warning against any large-scale tree removal in this exact location. His calculations were precise and prophetic. Clear cutting would eliminate the natural stormwater absorption capacity of the forest ecosystem, directing 100% of rainfall toward the downstream development area. During heavy storm years like this one, the result would be catastrophic foundation flooding for any homes built in the natural watershed, which was exactly where Karen's house sat. The environmental report included detailed topographical maps showing that my property was naturally elevated above the flood zone, while the HOA development occupied the traditional overflow area. Samuel had actually recommended against building there, but developers in the 2000s had ignored his warnings. Reading his meticulous ecological notes felt like receiving a message from beyond the grave. The watershed will reclaim its natural flow patterns eventually. Clear cutting will only make the flooding worse when it does. Jennifer spread the financial evidence across my workbench while I laid out Samuel's environmental predictions. The pattern was clear as spring water. Karen had embezzled nearly $110,000 from her neighbors to build an ecological disaster that would destroy their homes while keeping mine protected by elevation and remaining tree cover. This is conspiracy, fraud, environmental destruction, and possibly racketeering, Jennifer said, organizing documents into neat legal categories. The EPA violations alone could put her in federal prison. Add in the financial crimes, and she's looking at serious time. Rebecca joined us for coffee, studying the evidence with her librarian's eye for systematic organization. She engineered her own downfall, she said quietly. Every move she made to hurt us actually created more evidence against her. Outside, April rains were falling harder than usual, and the destroyed oak grove was starting to erode without root systems to hold the soil together. Weather Service predictions called for the wettest spring storm season in 25 years. Karen had built herself an environmental time bomb and handed me the evidence to convict her when it exploded. The only question now was whether I should warn her neighbors what was coming, or let hydrology teach the lesson Samuel's forestry had predicted 60 years ago. My workshop had transformed from a woodworking studio into something that looked like an environmental war room designed by scientists who'd watched too many legal dramas. Every surface was covered with ecological surveys, legal documents, financial records, and Samuel's forestry drawings. The coffee maker ran constantly. The landline never stopped ringing. And Rebecca had started bringing sandwich platters for the steady stream of environmental allies showing up at our door. The restoration of Samuel's 1940s hand tools sat in the corner, finally completed, a symbol of bringing damaged things back to life, which seemed appropriate considering what we were planning for the oak grove. Dr. Patricia Williams, the environmental attorney from Emory's legal clinic, had officially taken my case pro bono after seeing Jennifer's financial evidence. Patricia was the kind of lawyer who'd rather fight polluters than chase personal injury cases, and she approached environmental law like a chess grandmaster with a conservation biology degree. "Tom," she said, spreading out a timeline across my workbench, "we're not just fighting one case here, we're fighting 5 separate legal battles simultaneously, and we're going to win them all." The strategy was elegant in its ecological complexity. Federal case, endangered species, act violations and unauthorized habitat destruction. State case, conservation easement infringement and environmental permit fraud. County case, building code violations and improper environmental assessments. Civil case, fraud, conspiracy, racketeering, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Environmental case, criminal destruction of protected ecosystems. Each case reinforced the others like interconnected ecological niches. Even if Karen somehow won one battle, the other 4 would destroy her. And thanks to something Patricia called the private environmental enforcement doctrine, we could recover all legal costs when we won. Environmental law actually encourages citizens to prosecute violators when government agencies can't keep up with enforcement. The financial investigation had grown into something beautiful and terrifying. Jennifer had recruited 3 more graduate students and a forensic accounting professor who treated HOA environmental fraud like a particularly interesting research project. They discovered that Karen's pattern of inflated environmental contracts extended back 4 years, involving landscaping, pest control, and legal consulting fees that all traced back to her insurance industry network. Total estimated embezzlement, over $275,000 from homeowner assessments. That wasn't just civil fraud. It was federal environmental racketeering territory, with prison sentences measured in decades rather than years. Meanwhile, I was designing the forest restoration using Samuel's original surveys and modern conservation biology standards. The reforestation plan would prevent erosion while rebuilding wildlife habitat at a total cost of about $45,000, less than one-third what Karen had wasted on her ecological disaster. The Georgia Conservancy had committed $35,000 to the restoration fund. The Sierra Club added another $20,000. Local environmental groups, birding clubs, and even some guilty HOA members were contributing to what we'd started calling the Magnolia Springs Forest Resurrection Project. The community organizing had taken on a life of its own. Weekly meetings in my workshop drew 40 or 50 people, including veterans who appreciated seeing a timber surveyor's great-grandson fight bureaucratic environmental destruction. Rebecca handled the social media campaign. Save Magnolia Oaks had over 7,500 followers and growing. Dr. Angela Rodriguez from the University of Georgia's Forest and Natural Resources Department had volunteered to serve as our expert witness. She'd reviewed Samuel's 1968 predictions and confirmed them with modern computer modeling. The clear-cutting would increase flood risk by 350% during heavy storm conditions, directing all that water straight toward the HOA homes' foundations. Your great-grandfather was 60 years ahead of his time, she told me, studying his hand-drawn ecological charts. This is exactly how we design sustainable watershed management today. Karen didn't just destroy a forest. She eliminated a sophisticated natural infrastructure system that had been protecting the entire valley. The media strategy was coordinated through Patricia's office. Environmental reporters loved the David versus Goliath angle, but we were being careful to focus on habitat protection rather than personal revenge. The story was spreading beyond Georgia. Conservation magazines, environmental law blogs, even a documentary crew from Georgia Public Broadcasting. But the secret weapon was still Samuel's historical evidence. His 1940s photographs showed exactly how the oak forest had handled severe storms for decades without causing any property damage. Those images would be devastating visual evidence in court, proving that clear-cutting created flood risk rather than preventing it. Weather Service predictions were confirming our worst-case environmental scenarios. Heavy spring storm activity across the southeast, warmer than normal temperatures accelerating rain cycles, and multiple severe weather systems headed our way during peak storm season. The destroyed watershed was going to face its first real test, and it was going to fail spectacularly. Margaret Chen had become our inside intelligence source, reporting on increasingly desperate HOA board meetings where remaining members were starting to panic about legal and environmental liability. 4 board members had already resigned, claiming they'd been misled about the project's legality and ecological impact. The timeline was accelerating faster than spring storm development. Federal EPA investigation formally opened. County DA announced criminal investigation into HOA environmental fraud. State Environmental Agency issued emergency habitat restoration orders. Multiple class action lawsuits filed by other HOA environmental victims across Georgia. Rebecca and I spent our evenings walking through the destroyed forest, planning its resurrection. The smell of chemical herbicide still lingering in artificially scorched earth. The silence where birdsongs used to celebrate each dawn. It was heartbreaking but temporary. "How long until we can bring it back to life?" she asked. I calculated seasonal growing patterns, legal timelines, and reforestation schedules. By next spring, this forest will be more magnificent than Samuel ever imagined, assuming we survive this storm season first. Environmental desperation has a particular smell, part synthetic air freshener, part fierce sweat, and part the acrid chemical burn of an ecosystem in collapse. That's what filled Karen's insurance office at 6:15 a.m. on April 18th, when she called me for an emergency meeting that felt more like an environmental hostage negotiation. "Tom," she said, sliding another envelope across her glass desk, "I've been reconsidering our situation. Maybe we can find a mutually beneficial environmental solution." The envelope contained a cashier's check for $850,000 and a non-disclosure agreement that would have made chemical companies proud. Take the money, relocate outside Georgia, transfer my conservation easement to an environmental trust managed by the HOA, and never speak publicly about forest restoration, environmental law, or HOA ecological governance. The threat was barely disguised. Legal battles destroy families, Tom. Ask Rebecca how her library career would survive if the county commissioners heard about her husband's radical environmental activism. I'd brought my digital recorder again, perfectly legal in Georgia, and Karen's next words were criminally perfect. "If you don't take this final offer, I'll personally ensure that every contractor, every supplier, every business owner in this county knows you're a troublemaker who costs people money. Your wife's library position, your woodworking hobby, your reputation, all of it can disappear. I have connections you can't imagine." That same night, my workshop got hit again. This time, they weren't just vandalizing. They were sending an ecological message. My completed wood projects were destroyed with chainsaws, sawdust scattered like environmental confetti. Samuel's original forestry notebooks were torn apart, some pages burned, others soaked with motor oil. But they'd made a crucial mistake. The upgraded security system I'd installed after the first attack captured everything in high-definition color. 3 figures in masks, systematically destroying my property, followed by a white Range Rover with distinctive vanity plates picking them up at 2:33 a.m. One of the vandals was wearing $400 hiking boots that matched a pair I'd seen on Karen's 19-year-old daughter. The psychological warfare escalated into something that belonged in an environmental thriller. Anonymous reviews bombing Rebecca's literacy programs. Unprofessional conduct, environmental indoctrination, unsafe ideology for children. Someone created fake social media accounts spreading lies about my scientific credentials, claiming I'd been fired from natural resources for environmental extremism and anti-development terrorism. The county library board called Rebecca in for a concerned conversation about complaints regarding her husband's increasingly radical environmental behavior. 5 families canceled their children's participation in library environmental education programs after receiving anonymous letters warning them about dangerous eco-terrorists in the education system. But here's what Karen fundamentally misunderstood about environmental scientists. We document everything systematically. Every threat, every act of vandalism, every anonymous complaint went into a database that would have impressed federal investigators, because that's exactly what they'd become.